All right, well, thank you very much for that introduction. Yes, I'm going to talk about Madame Blavatsky, who is not quite a contemporary of Carlyle, but sort of the next generation, sort of the late Victorian period. She's with us. These are the astral bells that were known to accompany the phenomena that she could produce. And apparently she could do it on command, and she got in some trouble for it, and after a certain point she refused to do anything like that. I usually wait until the end of the talk to put in the plug for my book, but since it turns out that I usually don't get through all the material in my talk, I'm going to put the plug in up front here. So it's the book, Madame Blavatsky, The Mother of Modern Spirituality. Why do I have that subtitle? I think it's because if you're interested in Tibetan Buddhism, if you're interested in reincarnation, if you're interested in sort of the roots of all the religions, if you're interested in ancient civilizations, if you're interested in all the kinds of things that we associate sort of since the late 60s, early 70s with what we call the New Age and a variety of other sort of metaphysical, spiritual pursuits, you have Madame Blavatsky to thank for that. If we wanted to somehow extract her influence on modern spirituality, if you wanted to make it HPB free, her full name is Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, and she liked being known as HPB, it would suddenly seem rather anemic. A great many things would disappear. And that doesn't mean that everyone in this room or everybody out there who goes to a health food restaurant or meditates knows anything about Madame Blavatsky, but she basically was the medium, as it were, for these things to reach the West and to become popular in the way that we understand them now. So, who was Madame Blavatsky? That's a very good question. I'm one of the many people who have attempted to, if not answer that, at least to find out how difficult a question it is to answer. There are many biographies, many attempts to try to note the truth about Madame Blavatsky, but as one of her more, let's say, generous investigators, a fellow named K. Paul Johnson, who wrote a book called The Masters Revealed, said that Blavatsky is one of these people who goes out of her way to make things difficult for the biographer. This is something that's true of quite a few characters within what we might call the Western esoteric tradition. We can start with Plotinus, who was the Greek philosopher in the circa 200 AD in Alexandria, who's sort of headed a school of Neoplatonism, a kind of mystical rereading of Plato. He refused to have any portraits taken of him, painted, or obviously no photographs at the time, no selfies. But he said, my physical form is not my true being. My true being is this inner self that I'm trying to reach and understand. And we can take it up to more contemporary times in the form of Carlos Castaneda, who's, he was the author of many books of faction, based on the character Don Juan, the Yaqui Indian who introduced him to the use of ceremonial practices involving certain drugs. And Castaneda famously wouldn't have any photographs taken of him, and there's always shots with his hat in front of his head, and as if he's running, just got arrested and doesn't want any photographs taken, and that kind of thing. So this is a tried and true kind of theme in the Western esoteric tradition, is somehow you cover your tracks. One of Blavatsky's followers, in the sense that came after G.I. Gurdjieff, who was another enigmatic character, he too went out of his way to make things difficult. But just to give you a quick run-through of who possibly be, or the many things that add up to being a Blavatsky. She was revolutionary, a spiritualist, a music teacher, cousin to her future Russian prime minister, a circus horseback rider, a journalist, a Russian spy, possibly a prostitute, drug addict, but certainly the granddaughter of a princess, among many other things. She's been described as an explosive madcap, one of the most accomplished, ingenious, and interesting impostors in history, a cheeky creature, and electrically charged Leyden jar. So if you know anything about electricity and science, you know what a Leyden jar is. If you touch it, boom, sparks go off. She's been compared to an Irish peasant woman, and has been called the founding mother of the occult in America. So, not too bad. Right, so. But what I'm going to say is that I think she also deserves a place among the makers of the modern world. I was going to put Darwin in there, but 3 is better than 4, so he kind of predates Marx. He's one of the earlier makers of the modern world, with Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, who didn't care for Marx and is staring at him very, very nastily there, and Sigmund Freud, who figured them both out. But these are the ones, you know, we consider to be sort of makers of the modern world. They created the modern mindset, the world we all kind of take for granted. But I would add one more figure there. I'd add Blavatsky. Now, you may ask, why am I saying that? What grounds do I have for this assertion here that Blavatsky should share the podium with Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud? Well, let's look at some of the people that she influenced. The first one there is Vasily Kandinsky. He's generally known as the founder of abstract art, although, strangely enough, a woman painter, Hilma F. Klint, a Swedish painter, may have predated him. She too was a student of Madame Blavatsky and also an offshoot of Theosophy, Anthroposophy, which was started by, from Theosophist's point of view, the renegade Theosophist Rudolf Steiner in the early 20th century. Kandinsky, as you say, he wrote a famous book, The Spiritual in Art, in which he foresaw a kind of coming new spiritual age that was going to be somehow brought about by the discoveries of abstract art, which are informed by his theosophical studies. Thomas Edison, who was an enlightened one and an Illuminati of a different kind. Among the other things that he invented was, as we know, the electric lights that are, you know, helping us to keep things dim in this room here. He was an early member of the Theosophical Society. We'll get along to that. At the time that he joined, he was trying to invent a kind of recording device that would be able to record the spirit voices that were coming in seances and things of that sort. Again, he was a very early member of the Theosophical Society. And we have W.B. Yeats over here, winner of the Nobel Prize in, I think, for literature in 1923. He was an early member of the Theosophical Society in Dublin, in Ireland. When he came here to London, he met with Madame Blavatsky. I'll get on to telling a bit of that story later on. But he was very, very influenced by the theosophical ideas, and they appear in quite a few of his poems. There's a few more. We got L. Frank Baum, creator of Wizard of Oz. The Wizard of Oz books, we all know the movie, but the books, there's quite a few of them, and they're rich in theosophical ideas that he picked up through his early membership of the Theosophical Society. In the middle there is Alexander Scriabin. He was a Russian composer of the fin de siècle of the 1890s. He's known for works like the Poem of Ecstasy and the Poem of Fire. He was an ardent theosophist. He, like Kandinsky, but through music, he believed that art was the way we can reach the higher worlds, the other planes, the spiritual dimensions. He envisioned a work that sadly he left unfinished and was never performed. It was a huge mass that he had wanted to be performed in the Himalayas. And it would be the end of a week-long sort of mystery experience like the ancient Greek mysteries at Eleusis and Delphi and places of that sort. And along with a huge choir and a huge symphony orchestra, he also devised something called a color wheel. That would project colors. It was like an early light show. It would project colors that were associated with the music, and this was another theosophical idea, what's called synesthesia, that there are certain colors and certain sounds that kind of go together, and that they have a significant sort of spiritual meaning. This rather dour-looking gentleman at the end there is T.S. Eliot, who lampooned Madame Blavatsky in his famous poem, The Wasteland. He calls her Madame Sosostris. She has a wicked pack of cards, which is actually a low shot because Blavatsky did not tell fortunes and she didn't use the tarot. But in a way, Eliot's kind of covering over his own tracks because while he didn't sit at Madame Blavatsky's feet, he did sit at the feet of a fellow Russian, the philosopher P.D. Uspensky, who lived in England, came here in 1921, and he's most known as a follower of G.I. Gurdjieff, who I mentioned already, but he wrote a book called Tertium Organum that became a surprise bestseller in England and America, and it's full of theosophical ideas. And in 1921, he was invited He was saved from a white Russian immigrant camp in Constantinople, soon to be Istanbul, by Lady Rothermere, who was the wife of the newspaper baron at the time, because she was a very devoted reader of Ouspensky's book, and she invited him to come to London. And in St. John's Wood, she had a salon much like that, where Ouspensky gave a talk, and Eliot and Huxley and Gerald Hurd and quite a few other people from the London literary scene at the time were there. I mean, you can find a lot of theosophical ideas in Eliot's later poems, like the Four Quartets. This gentleman here is W.Y. Evans Wentz, which is a great name. He put together and had translated the text that we know as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, thus inaugurating the fastest growing religion in the West. Madame Blavatsky is responsible for that. People like Richard Gere and lots of Hollywood celebrities that are into Tibetan Buddhism, I don't know if they know about Madame Blavatsky, but they have her to thank for their interest in Tibetan Buddhism. Gentleman in the middle is D.T. Suzuki, who introduced Zen Buddhism to the West in the early 20th century. And he was later tangentially responsible for much of the Beat generation, because people like Jack Kerouac, Gary Snyder, Allen Ginsberg, and others like that were very taken with Zen Buddhism. They weren't that interested in Theravada, which is a bit dull, and the Mahayana hadn't quite hit with them either. They liked Zen because it was kind of fast and quick and boom, man, wow, you know. So if you know Kerouac's novel, The Dharma Bums, there's a great deal of Zen Buddhism in there. And taking up to contemporary times, Tenzin Gyatso, the current Dalai Lama, he spoke very highly of a book of Madame Blavatsky's called The Voice of the Silence, which is a short meditative text, which is rather different from these other huge tomes that she was responsible for, which we'll get around to. And even though Blavatsky's interpretation or her kind of form of Tibetan Buddhism has been criticized by more academic, stringent sort of students of it, it was sort of responsible for the whole kind of wave of Tibetan Buddhism starting, and the Dalai Lama acknowledged that in an introduction to a later edition of The Voice of Silence. And just one more little group here to give you some idea who we're talking about. And we have here Annie Besant talking about a woman of power. She had some and she wanted a lot. Got her hands on a great deal of it. Annie Besant, no, she was a suffragette. The Match Girl strike. She fought for birth control. She had an affair with Bernard Shaw. She was jailed. You know, she was a martyr. But when she was given one of Blavatsky's books, The Secret Doctrine, to review for a journal called the Pall Mall Gazette, 1891 when he came out, whose editor, by the way, was W.T. Stead, and he was one of the fatalities on the Titanic. Interesting tangent there. She met Blavatsky and was converted on the spot. Blavatsky said to her, "Oh, Miss Besant, if only you would come among us." And she did. She melted right then and there. Someone else who was deeply influenced by Blavatsky was Mohandas Gandhi. You often hear stuff about Blavatsky being responsible for a lot of kind of weird racism, kind of weird right-wing occult racism. She was supposed to have sort of introduced the ideas of kind of occult racism to some early, well, they weren't Nazis at the time, but proto sort of Aryan kind of thinkers. I'm thinking of Guido von List, if you know about him, his school of Ariosophy in Vienna in the early 20th century. But actually, she had more influence on Gandhi than Hitler, anybody else. I'll tell you the story later on if I get to it. I'll tell you now. I'll repeat it. What happened was that Gandhi was in London and he was busy trying to be Ben Kingsley. You know, he was like wearing bowler cap and suit and all that kind of thing. And he met these two. They're always depicted as brothers, but they actually were cousins. Young men who were very interested in meeting a real, full-blooded Indian, as it were, because they were deeply interested in Indian religion and Indian scriptures, and they spoke to him. They said, "Oh my God, wouldn't it be great for all three of us to try and read the Bhagavad Gita in the original language?" And Gandhi had to very shamefacedly admit that he had never read it in any language. He was taught to ignore all that kind of stuff. The Christian missionaries that taught him told it was all nonsense and superstition, and they spoon-fed him Christianity and all that kind of thing. And they said, well, in that case, you have to come meet Madame Blavatsky. And so they pulled him over to, I think it's when she was living on Avenue Road over in, it could be in Holland Park. She lived in Holland Park, she lived on Avenue Road over near Regent's Park as well. But they pulled her over to her place, and she had a talk with him. And after that talk, he said the Bhagavad Gita became the most central book in his life. And his doctrine of non-violent resistance was based on the Bhagavad Gita and based on his talk with Madame Blavatsky. And the fellow who followed on after Gandhi, just to say, even on his last day, Gandhi spoke well about theosophy throughout his entire life. And even on the last day when he was assassinated, in his journal, he had written an article praising theosophy. The fellow who took over when India actually got its independence was Jawaharlal Nehru. He was initiated into, well, you weren't really initiated, but he kind of joined the Theosophical Society by Annie Besant. Annie Besant was around when Gandhi came and visited Madame Blavatsky on that occasion. So I think, if you take a look at these people, you might feel that there is good reason to suspect that there are, some valid credentials behind the idea that Blavatsky is as important, let's say, just in terms of cultural influence and the effect she's had. I mean, these are only a few of the people. There's many, many others, and this is in the broader kind of cultural world. I mean, she's had an enormous influence on the whole sort of spiritual, esoteric, other kind of world. But that doesn't count so much. But when you realize the amount of influence she's had on people that we all know, it seems to pack a bigger punch. So let's get some idea where she was from and what she was about. I was in search of the unknown, and she found it. She was born in 1831 in, it's called Dnepropetrovsk now, and it's in the Ukraine. At the time it was Ekaterinoslav, and it was in Russia. And we all know that Russia has some confusion over what's Ukraine and what's Russia. That was going on back then, and it's going on now. Her mother was the daughter of, her mother's mother was the daughter of the princess. So she doesn't quite fall into the noble line herself, but her mother's grandmother, let's say, was the daughter of the princess. Her father was a German military man, Peter von Hahn. She was born Helena von Hahn. Her mother was a very famous and popular and well-respected novelist at the time. This is the time, she's born in 1830s. Her mother's writing after, her mother had her, I think, when she was 17. Her mother was writing around this time. It's the time of people like Gogol. Pushkin is a little bit earlier than that, Turgenev, getting up to Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. Her mother was very, very highly respected as a writer. Valerian Belinsky, who was one of the great Russian literary critics at the time, spoke very highly of her. She was considered the Russian George Sand. And she wrote a lot about the woman's plight and at the time. And she herself was not a particularly happy marriage. Her husband was a hard-nosed, practical man who didn't really think much about her literary pursuits and her poetry and dreams and all that. So it was kind of a mismatch. And a lot of that frustration, a lot of that longing went into her writing. And I think it trickled down into Helena herself, because she wasn't going to be trapped in anything like that. And incidentally, Blavatsky's sister also became a writer of children's tales. And many of Blavatsky's critics said that she too became a writer of fiction, with all of these books about occult science and the occult history of mankind and so on and so on. Apparently, again, around the time when she was born, this was the reign of Nicholas I. He was a very repressive, conservative Tsar, and he had sort of stopped all the reforms that his predecessor Alexander I, who was much more sort of open-minded and was even sort of open to quite some esoteric things, as I hope we'll get on to. He had to clamp down one of the reasons was that the Freemasons were very much involved in what was known as the Decembrist Revolt, or the Decembrist Uprising, which happened in 1825. And they were put down very quickly, and Nicholas just imposed. There was, the order of the day was orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. And we can say that Blavatsky, when she came of age, turned that all around. And I think it was, what did I write here? Subversion, unorthodoxy, subversion, and cosmopolitanism, which is, in a way, is the polar opposite of the kind of order of the day in which she was born into. Of course, as soon as she could, she hightailed it out of there. One of the things that set her on her path in the journey of unknown was coming upon her great-grandfather Pavel Dolgorukov's occult library. Now, Pavel was a Russian Freemason of the Rosicrucian sort of branch. Now, I can't go into too much detail about who the Rosicrucians were Freemasonry, or the very important impact that Freemasonry had on Russian history at this time, and in the 19th century. But what was involved was that this Masonic group, this is the time of the real Illuminati. Not the people you'll come across on the internet, or Kanye West, or these kind of people like that. It's the real Illuminati. They existed very, very briefly. They were the brainchild, or brain-dead child, actually, of a fellow named Joseph Weishaupt, who was a Bavarian Mason, who actually, he was completely the opposite of what Freemasonry was about in many ways. He had no occult interests whatsoever. He did want to overthrow the monarchies of Europe. He basically wanted to get rid of the Habsburgs and all that kind of thing. And so he created this kind of subgroup, the Illuminati. And he attracted quite a few people, some famous people, Goethe, people like that, were interested in this kind of thing. But it never really got off the ground. And when the Bavarian government heard about his sort of plan, they kind of squelched it very early on. So that's about it. I think they were out of business by 1785. They've been blamed for everything since then. But that was like the extent of their real existence. But they had real political plans, and not only the Illuminati, but other Freemasons at the time had real sort of, what we would consider progressive political plans, in the sense that they wanted to get rid of the monarchy, they wanted to go to the oppressive regimes that were in place at the time, they wanted to open things up to a more liberal view, and this is very much goes back to the earlier Rosicrucians who were in the early 17th century, the early 1600s. Again, you might just want to look them up. Again, there's somebody who really existed at some point, and then later on lots of groups took the name Rosicrucian, and they don't have anything to do with them really. But they were real factual people who existed at a time in the early 1600s. But in any case, Blavatsky came upon this wonderful occult library that her great-grandfather had. And in the midst of this, she says that she discovered these documents that talked about this plan that the hidden superiors had to change the map of Europe. And the hidden superiors are an aspect of this particular Freemason group that her great-grandfather belonged to. It was called strict observance. And hidden superiors were people you didn't know who they were. They wore masks, or you never heard from them. They were Mr. X, basically. But it was called strict observance because you had to observe whatever they said. You had to strictly, whatever commands they gave, you had to sort of do them. And this was the more mystical sort of side of Freemasonry. There's ceremonial magic, alchemy, and a variety of other what's considered occult kind of pursuits, and scientists were involved in this. So this really got her going when she came upon this. And it's been said that she had psychic experiences from her youth, and she always felt a kind of something was there, and she didn't know quite what it was. And then when she came upon this library, she said, "Oh, this was it," and this sort of sent her on her road. Now, what happened is that, well, two things happened at this point. Oh, I should say that Blavatsky's mother died when she was 11, when she was quite young, and so this was something that was really important to her, an important effect on her as well. She was given to her maternal grandmother to bring her up, and that's how she came into contact with her grandfather's library. She meets someone called Prince Golitsyn, who was a young man, a bit older than she was at the time. She was a teenager now, and he tells her of his own searches in the East and other places for secret knowledge, hidden wisdom, all this kind of thing. And he excites her, talking, by telling her all these stories about the people he's met, these kind of seekers of truth, like himself, who journey basically they network at the time before you have the internet and anything like that. Prince Galitzин's own great-grandfather was a very important character in the Masonic circles at the time when Blavatsky's great-grandfather was there too. He was very important. He actually was very close to Tsar Alexander I and gave him sort of spiritual literature to read. And there's stories that Tsar Alexander I faked his death and went off to a monastery. And apparently, during the early Bolshevik time, they exhumed the corpse and the coffin was empty. So, don't know, but this is something that was there. But what happens is that she marries an older man, Nikifor Blavatsky, who is the governor of a place called Irvion, sorry, I'm getting a little dyslexic here. And he's about twice her age, a little bit more than that. She's about 17. It's unsure why she marries him. Some people say it's because nobody else would have her. Some people say it was on a bet. Some people say she thought in advance to marry this guy and actually ditch. You know, he was a way to get out of her family, to get out of where she was, because she wanted to hit the road and journey for the unknown. In any case, she marries him, and the marriage remains unconsummated. In fact, Blavatsky remains celibate throughout her whole life. In fact, at one point, to prove that she was not the mother of an illegitimate child, and also that she had not spent time in the flesh pots of Paris. And if you have any idea of Madame Blavatsky's fulsomeness, you might wonder if anyone would have been interested in her in the flesh pots of Paris. Excuse me, I'm sort of making a sort of weightist statement there, I guess. But in any case, she was accused of sort of having a very loose life, and at one point she had a gynecological examination to prove that she was impossible for her either to have sex or to have children. And in her own very forthright, frank language, she said, a cucumber is stuck up in there somehow. So there you go. But during this period, she hit the road, hightailed it out of where she was in the Caucasus with her crestfallen husband, and her booty holes wandered quite a bit. Exactly what happened between her leaving her husband and turning up in 1873 in Battery Park in New York City is not quite absolutely certain. A lot has been said, where she went, what she did, who she met, and not a heck of a lot of it can be corroborated. But she crossed the American Middle West in a Conestogan wagon. She apparently visited the pyramids in Mexico, the pyramids in Egypt as well, traveled through Greece, most of Europe, variety of places, but the most controversial place where she said to have traveled was in Tibet. She said that she had journeyed in Tibet 3 times trying to get there, and finally she got there, and all told had spent 7 years in Tibet. Now, whether this is true or not, there isn't a knockout punch saying no, she couldn't have been there. But equally so, all the evidence that suggests she may have been is purely circumstantial. So if you want to know, you have to buy my book and read, and you can find out all the stuff in there about her. So, but it's been said that she spent 7 years in Tibet. Why did she go to Tibet? She was sent there by her masters. We have Master Kuthumi over there, and Master Moria over there. Now, again, exactly when she first heard of the masters, when she first met them or not, it's up for grabs, depending what time in her life somebody asked her that question. The central story is that in 1851, during the Great Exhibition here in London, the Crystal Palace exhibition, she was there, she was traveling either with her great aunt, she was sort of her traveling companion, and while they were going through there, Master Moria appeared. And she was struck because this, she remembered, was the vision of the holy man that she had had all through her childhood. Again, there's all these retroactive sort of stories about, yes, when I was a little girl I had this vision, da-da-da-da-da, and all that. So, again, it's kind of like you have to put jigsaws together and make your own decision as to how much is true, how much is made up, who the masters really were. But that's sort of the central kind of story. So in 1851, she met one of the masters at the Great Exhibition in London. And he talked to her and he told her that she must come to Tibet. Because if she goes to Tibet, she will receive training in her psychic powers. She will receive training in the true spiritual philosophy, the true knowledge. And it's her job, her task, to bring this knowledge to the West. So, what's the place most in need of spiritual teaching in 1873? I don't know if you're old enough to remember the song by, I think it was Jay and the Americans in the 1960s, Only in America. Can a kid from anywhere get a job someplace and grow up a millionaire? And we know who they were talking about, 50 years ahead of time. But this is a picture of Orchard Street, Lower East Side, New York, about 1891. It's about just short of 20 years after Blavatsky turned up, but it wasn't vastly different. And if you see her over here, she has the ubiquitous cigarette. She smoked like a chimney, constantly. Unlike many spiritual people today, she didn't give a hoot about her health or well-being or any of that kind of stuff. Her cholesterol levels were scandalous. One of her favorite dishes was 2 fried eggs in a bowl of melted butter. Yes, and she smoked constantly. She was teetotal. Was against drugs, although she was accused of smoking hashish. And I remember when I was first reading about this stuff, the idea of her constantly rolling joints and smoking, wow, it's cool, and all that kind of stuff. But even back in the day, people weren't smoking back then; they were eating it most of the time. And the accusations of her smoking hash came from people that were trying to basically undermine her character. She became public enemy #1 among spiritualists. In her career, because she said that the spirits that were arising at these seances weren't Uncle Jack and Aunt Betty. They were the kind of astral hobos hanging around in the astral plane and nothing better to do, and they're happy to tell you whatever you want to hear. And she said all the spiritualists who were contacting somebody's dead aunt or grandmother, not that they knew they were faking, but they weren't contacting who they thought they were contacting. And the spiritualists at the time didn't care for that, and so they went out sort of defamation of character campaign against her. But there she is. She arrives there in New York. The story about her getting there, she was in Paris when she finally headed west. Again, I'm leaving so much out about what she did. She ran seances in Cairo. She headed kind of choir. I forget exactly which Eastern European country. She was said to be a circus bareback rider. She fought on the barricades against the papal forces with Manzini, with his Young Italy Risorgimento forces. She was an intense anti-Catholic, anti-Rome, and not so much anti-Christian, although she didn't really care for Christianity that much. But she still recognized it as one of the great religions. But she hated the Roman Church, and she hated the kind of power it had, and the sort of authority and the hierarchical structure. And she was more of a free-thinking humanist than anything else. I mean, she's associated with the occult, and nobody wants to touch her. I'm sorry I'm going off on a tangent here. I'm surprised feminists have not got a hold of her already, because you talk about women with power. I mean, she was one of the most powerful women in the 19th century. But nobody touches her because of the occult stigma. But she was more of a free-thinking humanist than an occultist. She's basically more about, liberal ideas of free speech and free thought, and not so much free love, because she thought sex was beastly. But she was not this kind of occult, theocratic, totalitarian kind of, hierarchical character that is usually associated with sort of occult kind of politics. She was the opposite. She was like a very, very intense kind of liberal, I would say. The story with her arriving in America was that she had a first-class ticket, but when she was at the dock, she saw this woman and her children. They were in distress, and she talked to them, and they said that, well, their husband was supposed to turn up with the tickets, but he never showed, and they didn't know what to do, and they didn't know what happened to him, anything like that. They had no money, so she cashed in her ticket and bought 4 steerage. And so she crossed the Atlantic at the bottom. If you ever see those old movies, with people who cross the Atlantic and they're all on the bottom of the boat somewhere, sleeping on top of each other, she was, one of those folks. And when she turned up in Orchard Street, she lived at a women's cooperative. She worked as a seamstress. She's gone along very well with the Jewish kind of tailors there and all that sort of thing, because she's been accused of anti-Semitism at different times by different people, and there's no evidence for it whatsoever. So yeah, she turns up in America, and she basically becomes an American success story. This is a little ahead of the time, but what was really big at the time and had been in America since the 1860s was spiritualism. Spirits are among us, seances and things of that sort. I quickly mentioned that Blavatsky had held seances in Cairo. She held seances in Cairo after she survived the wreck of the Eumonia, which is the great naval the shipping disaster that was nobody knows about because the Titanic has eclipsed it. But this was like the big ship that went down before the Titanic did. Apparently, she swam to shore. So this was one tough cookie. But seances is a really hot thing, and one of the characters who she meets and sends her on her way is Colonel Henry Steele Olcott, and as we know, he was a hipster well in advance of his time. Now, Olcott is a very interesting character. He was an agriculturalist, he was a journalist, he was also, he was a military Civil War hero. He was also one of the few people that was part of the commission to investigate the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. But he was also a deep interest in spiritualism, what we know as psychic phenomena. He was a healer himself. And he was writing a series of articles about a particular sort of haunting that was going on in Vermont in a place called Chittenden. And it was ongoing. These spirits kept appearing in this house week after week after week. And he was up there writing like weekly reports for different newspapers. And Blavatsky, who had been sent by her masters to spread the word, she needed a good PR man. She needed somebody to sort of, be out there, helping her. So she focused on Olcott. And this is very much like later on, if you're aware of this, how Gurdjieff himself did this with this philosopher Uspensky, who I mentioned earlier. Very similar kind of situation where he needed a good front person. So she goes out of her way to seduce Olcott. And she goes up to this house in Chittenden where the hauntings are going on. And she's wearing what was known at the time as the Garibaldi shirt. And this was a red, bright red sort of military tunic with this buttons down there. And it has kind of regalia on it. And this was like given to her after fighting on the barricades with Manzini against the papal forces and all that. And she's smoking like a chimney. And she's all kind of done up and all that kind of thing. And he immediately sort of sees her and sort of is kind of fixated by her. And what happens is that gradually the kind of spirits, the kind of phenomena that's taking place change. And it isn't sort of local North American Indians that are kind of turning up, or local people from the town. Suddenly all these Russians turn up. All these Russian spirits kind of turn up. Kalmuks and people from the Caucasus and from the Ukraine and this kind of thing. And it turns out that Blavatsky is making it happen. She's not just the medium. She's not there sort of as a way for the spirits to come. The medium is like, you're the means by which the spirits communicate. They take you over. She's taking the spirits over. Talk about a woman of power. She was a woman of power. She absolutely convinced Olcott that she could make these things happen. This is what she had learned in her years in Tibet. She had learned to master the powers of the mind. And so they become the chums. Great friends, platonic relationship, they're together for about a decade. I have that line up there, glittering in badly wrapped parcel. This was how one of her biographers, Peter Washington, described her. This is how she turned up. She was kind of dressed like a Christmas tree. She always wore very flowing robes, lots of color and lots of kind of stuff and all this kind of thing. And she was actually, she was a woman of some size. I mean, I say in the book, I'm surprised there isn't a film made about her, but then in an age of sort of anorexic models, you're not going to have anybody wanting to play a 232-pound leading lady. But she, for the next 10 years, they're sort of inseparable. And the major thing they do, among many, many other things, is they start the Theosophical Society. Now, if you go over to Gloucester Road over by Baker Street, there's the offices there, the headquarters there of the Theosophical Society in London. They're still going. This is the original Theosophical Society sort of logo, as it were. There is no religion higher than truth. And you can see there's a swastika in there. There's the sort of Star of David. There's an Egyptian Ankh. There's, I think that's Om up at the top in Hindi. You've got the snake, the Ouroboros snake, which is a symbol of eternity, eating its own tail. It was basically, there's something for everybody there. It was a one-stop shop for religion, spirituality. And let me just read here, excuse me for a second. I can just read what, this was a bit later, but this was sort of the mission of the Theosophical Society, which was, it was formed in September 13, 1875 in Hell's Kitchen in New York, of all places. One is to form the nucleus of a universal brotherhood of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste, or order, of color, excuse me. The study of ancient and modern religions, philosophies, and sciences, and the demonstration of the importance of such study. Number 3, the investigation of the unexplained laws of nature and the psychical powers latent in man. So this was what the Theosophical Society was originally founded in order to do. And out of the 3 things, the thing that Blavatsky worked the hardest to bring about was the first one. To form this kind of universal brotherhood, regardless of sex, creed, gender, you know, whatever you want to, identity, politics, whatever you want to call it these days. And this comes out of her Masonic roots, because this was part of the Masonic mission in the 1780s, 1790s, and all that, and the Rosicrucian mission back in the 1600s. It was somehow formed, you know, basically a brotherhood of man and you know, women, of course, and all that. But I mean, that's the main thing, and that often gets obscured when people talk about her, because they mostly talk about, oh, she was a kind of fraud, a kind of, you know, medium psychic fraud, and all this kind of weird stuff. That's what she worked at the most. And one of the results of that happened after her death was in 1893 at the Chicago World's Fair. There was the first World's Congregation of Religions, where for the first time you had Catholics and Protestant and Russian Orthodox and Jews and Hindus and Buddhists and Baha'i and, you know, quite a few others meeting together and talking about and trying to have the kind of multi-faith consensus that's something that we all, you know, most of us sort of think is a good idea these days. So what we have here is got a stamp in India that shows how important the Theosophical Society was. I'll get on to that a little bit further. Back down there at the bottom, this is where the current Theosophical Society is in West 72nd Street, New York. I'm sorry, it's a bit squished, but you can see the kind of lectures they had, or A Place in the World, Life, Karma, Researches in Occultism. That's a postcard from the Indian headquarters of Theosophical Society in Adyar, where we'll get to in a few minutes. But up top there, that's a postcard from the Point Loma Theosophical Society in San Diego. This was started by a woman named Kathleen Tingley. And among many other things, one of the things that Theosophical Society and Theosophy in general is responsible for is for introducing the avocado into the California agricultural system. If you like your avocado toast these days, you have Madame Blavatsky to thank for that. After founding the Theosophical Society, she realized the society needed its Bible, and so she sat down and wrote this immense text called Isis Unveiled. If you know your ancient mythology, the whole idea of the veiled figure of Isis, you know, no man shall rent her veil and all that, because you can't, you know, we can't see the truth. We're not sort of up for the job and all that. But you know, she was ready to give the truth and give the truth out. And basically, what she does in Isis Unveiled is show that the magic of the ancients is the science of tomorrow, and we're kind of still working on that today, right? With sort of Graham Hancock and all that kind of stuff still going on. But she was one of the first ones who put it all together. It's an incredible compendium. And she wrote a lot of it in this place here. I'm sorry it's not a better shot, but this was her and Olcott's flat in New York, in Hell's Kitchen. It was called the Lamasery, because it was done up. You think this place is, you know, over-decorated. You should check it out. I mean, they did not go to IKEA for their stuff there. It was just completely, it had, you know, a variety of different exotic, Eastern mostly, or Egyptian as well, kind of motifs and themes. So one of the things in there, and there's a book named after this, is that they had a stuffed baboon that they had dressed in a tux. Or it was kind of, it was supposed to have like having a lectern in front of it, and like a book, and it was giving a lecture, and it was supposed to be like T.H. Huxley. or something like that. She was a big, one of the things, along with repackaging and representing to the modern reader, it sold out overnight. It was an incredible bestseller. The Magic Lore of the Ancients, was that Blavatsky presented the first philosophical and scientific criticism of Darwin. There were plenty of religious criticisms. The gentleman who is most often given the credit for this is Samuel Butler, who wrote The Way of All Flesh and Erewhon. In 1878, he started publishing a series of books where he was criticizing Darwin. He said Darwin had banished mind from the universe. And people like Bernard Shaw, in his plays, took up Butler's sort of torch and ran with it. But Blavatsky was ahead. Isis and Bale was published in 1877. And she basically says Darwin's right up to a point, but evolution doesn't stop there. In fact, everything, the entire universe, every little bit in the entire universe is going through this ongoing kind of evolution. So the evolution from monkey to man is only one bit, and from man to the gods is the next, and she's the one who's going to be showing us the way to that. And there's the announcement. J.W. Bolton was the publisher. He didn't expect it to be the hit that it was, but it sold out in the first week, its first printing, and continued and continued and continued. It's still in print today. A Master Key to the Mysteries of Ancient and Modern Science and Theology. And this is basically one of the kinds of ancient, mystical, magical kind of symbols that she's working with. We have the face of God, the face of the divine on the waters, and you have the Star of Solomon, and again you have the Ouroboros. I guess this is the Great Seal of, I can't really read it there. In any case, it's a very potent, magical sign. Okay, so what happened? Well, for some reason, very shortly after getting her American citizenship, Blavatsky and Alcott decide to pull up stakes and go to India. A few reasons why that may have happened. One was she was getting some bad press. Another was that she had got in contact with a group in India that had heard about her, and they thought that her work in the Theosophical Society and their own work, they too were trying to revive interest in the ancient religions, the ancient teachings and all that. And they thought perhaps the two can combine forces. We don't quite know exactly why, but in 1878, 5 years after coming to the States, and again, only a couple months after getting her American citizenship, so for most of her travels after this, she was an American citizen, they decide to go to India. And they have fantastic success. Blavatsky and Alcott are the first two Europeans to convert to Buddhism. At least that's what's said. Alcott became incredibly influential in Buddhism in Sri Lanka. It was Ceylon at the time. He basically taught the Buddhists Buddhism. They didn't know, much like Gandhi didn't know about it, didn't know about Hinduism. He sort of renewed the people of Ceylon, Sri Lanka, their understanding of their own roots and all that. And he's like a national hero there. There's a stamp, I think there's a couple train stations, there's some streets, there's a coin, all that kind of thing. So people would sort of take Alcott as kind of, sap, who was, kind of like a Homer Simpson character, who was kind of like, just sort of, had the wool pulled over his eyes by Blavatsky. He was a pretty smart cookie himself, so I don't think he's quite the fool that many people put him out to be. But what happens when they get to India, they're very successful, and they have two really important converts. One is A.P. Sinnett, over here, who was the editor of the Allahabad Pioneer, which was the biggest newspaper in India at the time. One of its writers was Kipling. And another figure over here is A.O. Hume, who later became very much involved in the Indian independence movement. And he was one of the strong people promoting the Indian National Congress. And I have up here Teacups and Teleportation, because this is when the kind of phenomena that Blavatsky was known for start to really happen, get going. She was doing things in New York. She was doing things in New York, but it's in India where it really gets going. I'm told I have 5 minutes left, so I don't know if I'm going to get through this whole thing again. See, this always happens. But there's a famous story when she's having a picnic, where she's invited to a picnic in a place called Simla. And the story goes is that they didn't bring enough teacups. They were going to have tea out in the jungle. And just sort of nonchalantly, Sinnett's wife says, "Oh, well, Madame Blavatsky, what will you will you indulge us in, we're missing a teacup, can you get one? All right, I will. She does it. And she makes one appear. They go digging somewhere under the ground. It's pretty deep. And the ground, it's not broken over. It's solid. It doesn't look like it's been dug. And the roots aren't ripped up. But under the roots of a tree, so if you're thinking tree roots, there's a teacup. That's the story. And she was known to materialize lots of different things. Roses fell from the ceiling. Cigarettes appeared. Again, she smoked a lot, so she probably needed them. Cigarette papers, things of that sort. And they spread the word. They're completely convinced by this. Sinnott writes a book called Esoteric Buddhism. And that's how people like Rudolf Steiner, W.B. Yeats, and other people first hear about Blavatsky. And always in pause. Other things that materialized were known in the Mahatma Letters. These were letters written to Blavatsky by the masters. And they too would just appear out of the ceiling. They would fall, and they'd be there. And after a while, not only Blavatsky was receiving these, but A.P. Sinnott. And you can go to the British Library, and there's a collection of them there, the actual letters. You can see them. Some are written in blue pencil, and some are written in red pencil. And they're very eloquent, very articulate, very well-written sort of epistles, letters, about the theosophical life. And they're very different in the way Blavatsky writes. So again, just by textual kind of evidence, she has her own particular style. It's a hectoring, haranguing, very loud style that bangs you over the head with stuff. These are very soft, eloquent, rather sober kinds of letters. You can check them out there. But this is the beginning of the downfall, as it were, or the big bump in the road. What happens is that during a visit here in London, Blavatsky meets some of the people from the newly formed Society for Psychical Research, which is still going. I think it's over in Queens, over by the Science Museum, over that neck of the woods, over there. And they talked to her and they said, we very much would like to investigate you. And she said, well, I can't do it now, I'm sort of busy, but if you come to India, I'll be happy, to show you what's up. And so they send this fellow named Richard Hodgson. And Hodgson he's kind of new to the job. And one of the things that Society for Psychical Research felt they had to do, they had to be even more skeptical than the skeptics. Because they were trying to prove this stuff was real. So they had to make sure there were no way they were getting the wool pulled over their eyes. No way they were getting hoodwinked. No, they were getting fooled. So they kind of started out thinking, you're going to try to fool me in the first place. Right? And so they send Hodgson over there, and at the same time as he goes over to investigate, there's a snake in the grass raises its head, and this is in the form of an old friend of Madame Blavatsky named Emma Colomb. And she was one of her friends in Cairo when, after surviving the wreck of the pneumonia, she was there, running seances. And she had sent Blavatsky, she had heard Blavatsky was in, she read the newspapers. Blavatsky's known the world over by now. All the stuff is in all the newspapers. After Sinnott wrote about it in the Pioneer, it got picked up by all the syndicated things, and it's worldwide, so it's kind of trending. It's tweet, there's lots of tweets about it. And so she hears about Blavatsky, basically doing well, and so she writes her a hard luck story, saying she's down and out, and anything you can do for us. And Blavatsky had a heart of gold, enormously generous person, not particularly good judge of character. Russians are like that. They love everybody. And so she invites her to come over. And so she does. So Emma and her husband show up in Adyar, in India. And one thing leads to another, and they tend to feel like they're being slighted. They tend to feel like they're not getting the kind of attention that they should get, or something like that. And so, long story short, they wind up going to a Christian missionary newspaper at the time with the story that is an expose on Blavatsky. It's all fake. There's no materialization. The letters have slipped through cracks in the ceiling. When you see the masters walking around, it's basically Blavatsky. She's got a big head on her shoulders, and she's kind of going around, and everyone's just getting taken in by this kind of thing. And Hodgson, who's like ready to make his name at the Society of Psychical Research, he listens to them, Blavatsky's not there at the time when he's there investigating. So he's not actually investigating her. He's investigating the milieu around her. I can't go into the details again, it's a plug by the book. But in the end, he decides, as I said in the beginning, that she's one of the greatest imposters of all time. And she's most likely a Russian spy. And this, because this was the time of the Great Game. This was the time of Kim. You know, this was the time of struggle for influence between Russia and Great Britain in India and in Tibet and all those kinds of places. So it stands to reason that she's really a Russian spy. And he admires her chutzpah, but he basically, and the things that she's most enraged at is not that he considers her a fraud, because people have heard that before, but that he thinks she's a spy. So she decides she wants to basically take this to court. But the others in the Theosophical Society are a little, they say, well, actually, it's not a good idea. What's going to happen is that you're going to have to prove that you can produce phenomena in court. Are you going to do that? Are you going to make a teacup materialize in court? I mean, come on, you know, we believe in you, but really, is that going to happen? Long story short, they convince her to step down and to leave. So in order to keep the Theosophical Society going, to keep its reputation going, she takes the blame. This is something that, this is part of the, there's a Russian spiritual way that's called the way of blame. And she takes it on. And she leaves. And she hits the road again. Strangely enough, I should say, many years later, the Society for Psycho Research actually retracted Hodgson's examination. They looked over it again, they said it was flawed, it had many, many mistakes in it. And so it's not exactly saying that she's not a fraud, that he didn't really expose her. But in any case, she hits the road. This is somewhere, I think, in London, where she's working on The Secret Doctrine. She's enormous at by this time. She can barely walk. I'll show you a picture of her in a moment. When she left India to come to Europe, she had to be hoisted on the boat, like, you know, cargo. She couldn't go up the gangplank. She was too heavy, too big. It wasn't only from her diet. She was affected with what's known as dropsy. I forget what it's called now, the contemporary. It's basically your body retains water, and she would have, like, her flesh was folded over in places like that. And so, you know, it's like in any case, you get the idea. So, she's hitting the road. She's in Germany, she's in Italy, she's in Switzerland, writing. She told Yeats, I write, like the wandering Jew, walks. She wrote and wrote, The Secret Doctrine. And this is the book that kind of established her later on now as kind of, it sort of overshadows Isis and the Veil, which I think is a better book, just in terms of readability. The Secret Doctrine is this occult history of the cosmos, of humanity, of the earth. And it's, you can't do a précis of it. It's just, I mean, the main thing is that, you know, the earth is part of this ongoing cosmic evolution. And there have been many other races living on the planet before us. The universe itself has gone through many different incarnations. She talks about the sort of Hindu idea of the sort of Manvantara and the Praladya, which is sort of these periods of activity and periods of sleep and all that. There's just a ton of stuff there. And this was something she wrote, and she felt she had to get this out, you know, before the end. And it's the book that Annie Besant was asked to review, and became what triggered her conversion. So here, she is in London. She winds up in London, I think about 1888. She was in Norwood for a while. She was over on Holland Park. But she's getting around in what was called a perambulator, a pram, basically. She couldn't walk. She was pushed around. This gentleman is G.R.S. Mead. I forget the other gentleman's name. Mead was a Gnostic, Theosophical, Hermetic scholar in his own right. He started the Quest Society, and he's very well known for many translations of ancient sort of spiritual and philosophical texts. But she was getting around in that. The last time she actually went to Europe and actually traveled was to see the Eiffel Tower, and it just been put up. So this is the context. So she comes to London. It's kind of this is London of beginning of Sherlock Holmes. It's a London of Jack the Ripper, and in fact she was even accused by Aleister Crowley of being Jack the Ripper. he never had a good word for most of this competition anyway. And again, some of her visitors. Young W.B. Yeats, he came. He's the one who said she reminded him of an old Irish peasant woman. He thought she had a remarkable sense of humor. And there's a strange thing, when he showed up, her cuckoo clock suddenly went haywire, sort of cuckooing. And she came out and she said, "Don't break my cuckoo clock," or something like that. She played what was known as Patience. She's here. There's always precipitated materialization, so watch your heads, folks. The astral bells went off. She played Patience, which is known as solitaire. This is a kind of a way, I think, that she put herself in a kind of trance. She played Patience all the time, this kind of thing. She was always sort of doing something to kind of... I didn't go into it, but there's good reason to suspect she somehow had a controlled multiple personality, a controlled dual personality. What I didn't say about when she was writing her books was that she would often gaze out into the middle distance and write. And these were quotations from books she didn't have on reference. And then she would send people out to go check, and they were mostly spot on most of the time. Alcott said when she was writing Isis Unveiled in the Lamasery that her face changed. She took on a completely different kind of physiognomy at different times. Her hair changed and all this kind of thing. So again, check it out for yourself whether you believe it or not. But these are all these kind of stories. I'm telling a tiny fraction of most of the stuff. In the middle is Annie Besson. As I said, she was asked to review The Secret Doctrine by W.T. Steed of the Pall Mall Gazette. She was completely taken over by Madame Blavatsky when she went there. She had to publicly recant her statements about birth control and contraception in order to officially join the Theosophical Society, because they were against contraception. Because all souls, as Monty Python told us a long time ago, are special, or whatever it is in that rather cheap shot they have in the film. And other things of that sort. So, and there's the young Mohandas Gandhi doing his best, as I said, to be Ben Kingsley. It's a story I told earlier when he met these two theosophists and they introduced him to her. So I think it gives you some idea who she is. Strangely enough, Blavatsky died on 8th of May, 1891. That's 5 days from now. That's known as White Lotus Day now. And theosophists around the world celebrate that day in remembrance of her. She had to pull up stakes once again, went into the Akasha, and well, I don't know where she is right now, but I'm sure it's someplace very interesting. Thank you very much.